Thanks for having me on, Anti-Ordinary. Let me take a whack at this guy. I've done quite a bit of research on a bit of Orange. He has an entire series titled Defining Evolution that misrepresents or categorically misunderstands every aspect of evolution, and I thought this video was part of that series. However, it turns out that he has two videos with the same name, the Epic Evolution Fails Slideshow. One is 7 minutes 43 seconds with his avatar, and one is 8 minutes 52 seconds with his real face. Strange, but let's get to his cartoon version.
Greetings, my friends, and welcome to the very first and sure to be remembered as historic presentation of the Epic Evolution Fail Slideshow, subtitled, If You Understand Evolution, Then You Know Why It's Wrong, and then subtitled, Chuck D and the New Monkey Band.
So, evolution is a subject that many thousands of researchers across the globe from a number of scientific disciplines study. They study genetics, comparative anatomy, biogeography, zoology, botany, mycology, microbiology, biochemistry, paleontology, and even fields like geology intersect with evolution. As someone who has worked for biologists who constantly utilize evolution, I would love to see Orange go up to a biologist and say, "If you understand evolution, then you know why it's wrong." I would also love to see the confusion on his face as he is laughed out of the building.
Just remember, it was your friends here at abitoforange.com that brought to you the world's first clear and useful definition for Darwinian evolution.
His definition is neither clear nor useful. It's, quote, evolution is an unguided natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes which did not previously exist. These new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior, both of which increase the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring, close quote. But what does it mean to increase genetic information, physical complexity, or behavior? How does one quantify any of those? The common definition of evolution is change in allele frequencies in a population over generations. It's that simple. Creationists, however, don't like this definition because they feel the definition of evolution has to be equated with evolutionary history, as Orange does.
The definition of evolution is created by coming to a clear understanding of what evolution is and what story it intends to tell. We start with the Darwinian Tree of Life. The Darwinian Tree of Life is the history of all life on Earth according to Darwinian evolution. In order to grow this tree, Darwinian evolution must be four things. 1. Evolution is something to do with living things. 2. Evolution is something about life changing over time. 3. Evolution is something which is intended to explain the origin of different kinds of plants and animals. 4. Evolution tells a story wherein all living things arose through past common ancestors, until, far back enough in time, we reach a first universal common ancestor, making the history of life on Earth a big tree of life. Or, going forward in time, it explains how simple things like bacteria became worms, which became fish, which became lizards, which became rodents, which became primates, which became humans.
Okay, I let him go on for a while because I can sort of agree with all his premises. Evolution is about living things, and evolution is about how the alleles of organisms change over generations, or time if you want. Third, if we're using kind in the vernacular and not as Berriman, then I can agree that evolution is intended to explain the origin of new kinds of organisms, especially species. Lastly, evolution in a general sense does entail common ancestry, ultimately among all living organisms. Now, the scientific definition of evolution doesn't entail all of these. The origin of new species and descent with modification necessitate, however, a change in allele frequencies in a population over generation. That's all that's required for new species to emerge. R.J. Downard likes to define evolution as natural branching common descent, which also includes all of Orange's premises.
In order to give rise to and grow the Darwinian Tree of Life, thereby accounting for all of the plant and animal kinds that exist now and which have existed in the past, evolution is an unguided, natural process which increases the genetic information in an organism, creating new genes which did not previously exist. These new genes then cause an increase in physical complexity and associated behavior, both of which increases the organism's ability to survive and pass on these traits to offspring. This definition takes into account the Darwinian Tree of Life and the basic story which evolution is intending to tell. We then took this understanding of the evolutionary model and examined the proposed mechanisms of evolution to see if any of them could cause the Darwinian Tree of Life to grow and create new kinds of plants and animals.
Yes, and you bungled every single mechanism, as we shall see.
First, with consideration to the title of Darwin's book, we looked at natural selection. However, natural selection cannot be the origin of any species, because it only removes variation from a species. It does not add any. Darwin said as much in his book, and so this rejection of natural selection as a mechanism of evolution comes from Darwin's own writings, as well as a clear understanding of what it is and what evolution is claiming to do.
Are you so arrogant that you think Charles Darwin, who wrote Origin of Species, contradicted in his work his own title? Since you've never read the book, you don't understand what it's about. Yes, natural selection only preserves traits, it doesn't create them. Take the example of the Galapagos finches. When finches from Ecuador colonized the Galapagos Islands, they were probably pretty closely related to each other. But as they invaded different parts of the islands with different environments, those environments acted on their traits. Natural selection preserved the traits that helped the finches survive in their respective environments, and as mutations accrued in the different populations, still being shaped by natural selection, they became different species. It's not that hard.
Next, we looked at genetic drift and migration. But this mechanism is literally just moving existing things from one place to another. Migration cannot be a mechanism of evolution because it cannot cause a new species, gene, feature, or behavior to come into existence.
No, that's not it. How did you mess this one up? What it does is literally in the name. Genetic drift is the variation in some alleles due to chance. Since alleles are being varied in frequency over generations, it's evolution. The other thing in the title was migration, but this is a misunderstanding of gene flow, which you didn't understand in your defining evolution video about it. Gene flow is about alleles moving from one population to another through interbreeding, like how we and Neanderthals exchanged some DNA. You mischaracterized it as just migration, but that ignores the whole part about genes.
Because it is such a popular definition of and proposed mechanism for evolution, we looked at changes in allele frequency. However, changes in allele frequency cannot be evolution, as they cannot create new genes, variations, or species. The ultimate failure of this proposed mechanism is that it is a statistical change, not a genetic one. This is mere census information, and cannot be evolution, nor even a mechanism of evolution.
Are you kidding me? How do you think speciation happens, and do you think it involves genes, and more specifically, alleles? Do you think it involves populations not having the exact same alleles? Do you think that, say, animal populations often speciate in one generation? Or do you think it often takes multiple generations for speciation to occur? If you think speciation requires alleles varying in frequency over generations between populations, often due to their differing environments, then you understand the basics of speciation. You also then understand the basics of evolution and why what you just said is wrong.
We looked at descent with modification. This was rejected because it is so ambiguous that it has no meaning. All this term can mean is change over time, which doesn't say enough to separate the origin of a species from the extinction of a species, and thus can't be said to be evolution.
Remember how your first criteria for what evolution is said that evolution involves living things? Then why did you include pictures of statues and a nuclear blast? Are either of those living? Now, descent with modification means that generations are continually occurring and that organismal traits are changing over those generations. Why would those traits be changing? Would it have anything to do with the population's alleles?
Furthermore, we acknowledge that many changes from one generation to the next can result from shuffling existing genes, or losing existing genes, neither of which are evolutionary changes because they do not grow the Darwinian tree of life.
Why don't they grow the tree of life? Obligate parasites often have free-living counterparts, so the ancestor of both had traits that were lost in the parasites. The parasites still speciated despite losing certain anatomical structures. That's how they become more specialized for their job. I mentioned in one video the shrew rat Posidentomes and how it lost its molars. Natural selection shaped its jaw to focus specifically on earthworms by elongating its snout and getting rid of its molars. Is that not evolutionary? If not, demonstrate how.
We looked at vestigial organs and structures and found that while they are listed on most textbooks and websites intending to promote evolution, these are literally the evidence of the loss of structures and functions, which is the exact opposite of what Darwinian evolution is intending to explain.
Vestigial structures are evidence of an organism's ancestry. Whale hind limbs, for instance, demonstrate even to professional creationists like Kurt Wise that whale ancestors were terrestrial. In that case, whales developed many other adaptations to an aquatic life, but yes, they lost their hind limbs in the process. I fail to see how that's not evolution. You showed the blind cavefish. There, they lost their eyes, but they had to enhance other senses to compensate for it.
We spent considerable time looking at the favorite mechanism for making not only new kinds of plants and animals, but comic book superheroes: mutations. Mutations are so unlikely to create new genetic information, and so much more likely to cause damage to existing genes, that the creation of a new gene by mutations is essentially impossible.
Mutations alone don't often create new species, even though this is possible. Polyploid speciation, for instance, happens in plants and has even occurred in a species of crawfish. The quote you supplied doesn't help your case since it says the great majority. It's also from a book written in 1964. Why are creationists so addicted to really old sources? As it happens, most mutations are neutral, causing neither harm nor help, but many are also harmful. So, there's documentation of plenty of beneficial ones as well. And where is your evidence that the creation of a new gene from mutations is essentially impossible? And what do you consider a new gene? Would you consider a non-coding sequence of nucleotides that became a functional gene, which occurred in Arctic codfish, creating their antifreeze proteins, a new gene created from mutations? If so, then you may be shocked to know that this isn't at all that rare.
We've never seen a beneficial mutation which adds information to a genome, and have only seen many examples of mutations causing harm to existing genes. The odds of mutations making a new functional gene is far less than the odds of flipping a coin heads up 1,000 times in a row.
Yes, there are many examples of beneficial mutations. You were shown one by Professor Stick, the apolipoprotein A1 mutation in an Italian family that you completely ignored. Why? Gene duplications often cause new genes or structures to form, such as novel propeller fans in the water strider Ragavalia, or a new petal pigment in the slender Clarkia. The reason you don't know about any of those is that you choose to ignore the ones presented to you and don't do any independent research on, say, Google Scholar.
Information requires a mind, and genetics, DNA in the machines of every cell, are packed full of information. Thus, evolution cannot be the cause, but rather, in the beginning, God created.
Wait, what? How did you determine that DNA needed a mind? You never even defined information. What observation have you directly made showing that God was tinkering with your genes? What experiment have you done to test the idea of God tinkering with any genes?
After we'd examined all of the proposed mechanisms of evolution, we looked at more alleged evidence for evolution, starting with fossils. The problem we discovered is that the fossils are not found in the Darwinian order, and have to be arranged that way according to evolutionary theory.
Are you actually kidding? That's the most cartoonish dinosaur footprint I've ever seen. Somehow, this theropod was flat-footed and was able to walk without making any indentations in the dirt. It's called the Delk print and isn't pushed by pretty much anyone except the bottom-of-the-barrel creationists like Carl Baugh and Ian Juby. Not even Answers in Genesis stands behind it.
The ages of the rocks and the fossils are based on circular reasoning, wherein the rocks date the fossils, and the fossils date the rocks, and the entire enterprise once again requires you to accept evolutionary theory as fact before you begin the process, so that evolution can be used as evidence for evolution.
No, you're showing your ignorance of history here. It was established long before Darwin penned Origin of Species that the Earth was ancient. And no one absolutely dates the rocks by the fossils or the fossils by the rocks. An absolute date is determined by radiometric dating, which you mysteriously left out. Huh.
Even worse, the fossils show no transitional forms, thus showing no evolution happening, even if the deep time evolutionary dates are accepted.
No, just asserting that there are no transitional fossils doesn't actually mean there aren't any. That bat fossil you showed is Onychonicterus, not that you care, which is currently the oldest bat. It tells us that flight evolved before echolocation did. Tiktaalik is a fossil showing characteristics of both sarcopterygian fish and tetrapods and was predicted to be in a certain place at a certain time by researchers. Creationism has never ever accomplished anything even close to that.
They also show stasis, meaning things staying the same for long periods of time unchanged, which again is evidence of no evolution happening.
No, in every single organism you show, there is phylogenetic data for it, meaning there is evolutionary data for it. Take the coelacanths. They first appeared in the Devonian some 409 million years ago. We understand that they were preceded by early sarcopterygians, such as Mimania, and stem coelacanths, such as King Minotus, before they finally arrived. There is also a large diversity in coelacanth forms over the millions of years. Curious how all that data is left out by Orange, probably since he doesn't care to do research.
Finally, the existence of plants and animals called living fossils prove that even if you accept the evolutionary dates, you cannot construct an evolutionary sequence from the fossils because we can't know from the fossils when an animal was on Earth or not, since, if you accept the evolutionary dates, they can be living on Earth for millions of years without leaving a fossil.
First, living fossil isn't a scientific term, it's a popular term, and in the cases where things are alleged living fossils, there is still a wealth of evolutionary data on them. In the case of platypuses, they haven't been around for 100 million years. They've been around for 9. Monotremes, though, have, which is what I think you're referring to, not that you can tell the difference. And the amount of time during which some organism lived can only be increased by fossils. However, if there are no fossils, then there's no evidence. Case closed.
The next bit of alleged evidence for evolution was molecular clocks. Some people try to claim that DNA changes at a constant and predictable rate, but this was shown to be false for several reasons. First, because DNA decays so quickly, we have to extrapolate far into the past where no evidence exists, thus making the entire concept speculation with no possibility of evidence.
The rate of DNA decay is highly variable based on the environment. You present this 500 years figure as though it's the one and only agreed upon number, but it's not. DNA has been recovered from Neanderthals many tens of thousands of years old. The same goes for certain elephants and horses. Do try to keep up with the literature.
Next, there is no agreement between clocks, and the same species can yield different dates depending on what you date and what assumptions you bring to the table. The
Citation, please.
biggest objection, in my humble opinion, is the fossil record. Evolutionary theory states that the fossil record shows species living on Earth unchanged for hundreds of millions of years. But clearly, if that were possible, it would prove that DNA does not change at regular and predictable rates.
We can't infer too much about the DNA of organisms from their fossils alone, though that's starting to change with the new field of paleogenomics, where modern genetics allows the scientists to replicate the ancient molecules or even the bones and teeth. But what we can see, even in the examples you present, is that organisms do indeed change. No one considers that dragonfly fossil to be the same species as the modern dragonfly, at least in part because the fossil is of a gigantic dragonfly. Orange is acting very Haranyaya-esque here by showing a picture of a fossil that looks somewhat like a modern organism, but not knowing enough about either to realize that they're not the same.
Finally, we looked at a textbook classic piece of support for evolutionary theory, homologous features. These are features believed to be shared by different species because that feature was passed down from a common evolutionary ancestor which had that feature. But again, we learned the double-edged sword which is evolution, as we saw that a common feature could not be called homologous unless we already believed that the species in question had a common ancestor with the feature in question. Thus, far from being evidence for evolution, we see that evolution and a particular evolutionary sequence must already be accepted before the common feature can even be called homologous.
You at least got a few things right. We understand that closely related organisms have many of the same features. All humans have the genes for making an arm composed of one bone, then two bones, then wrists, hand, and fingers. That is, even if these aren't properly expressed by the body. We got this feature from our parents, who got it from their parents, who got it from their parents. You accept the common ancestry of this feature, but only up to some arbitrary point. As it happens, most tetrapods, excluding the limbless ones who still have the genes for arms, and even a few fish, such as Eusthenopteron, have this feature. Why would only a specific subset of animals, all more closely related to each other genetically than to non-tetrapods, have this feature? And why does the concept of homology allow us to make predictions, like the prediction of a wishbone in theropod dinosaurs? Again, creationism doesn't make predictions like this because it can't. So that's pretty much the end of this video. Orange just repeats what he thinks is true and continues to ignore all data. He cites nothing and seems to have an extremely rudimentary grasp on every topic he brings up. But that's creationism for you. Thanks for having me on again, Anti-Ordinary, and I'll see you next time.